There is a story every French schoolchild was once required to memorize. 3 words. Nos ancêtres les Gaulois. Our ancestors, the Gauls. The story that came with those 3 words was equally simple. Brave Celtic warriors with painted faces and iron swords, living in forest villages, feasting on wild boar, and resisting the Roman legions until the very end. A people with an origin, a character, a fate. A people you could point to on a map and say, here is where France began. That story has been told so many times, for so long, that it stopped feeling like history. It felt like fact. Ancient DNA just looked at the bones and told us something different entirely. For most of recorded history, the Gauls occupied a clearly defined place in the Western imagination. They were the Celts of mainland Europe. Iron Age people who emerged from the Alpine foothills sometime around the 8th century BCE, speaking a continental Celtic language called Gaulish, and expanding outward in waves across what is now France, Belgium, and Switzerland. They built genuine cities. They minted their own coins. They traded amber and wine with the Mediterranean world. They were not the primitive forest dwellers that Roman propaganda sometimes depicted. They were sophisticated, connected, and politically complex. They were also, for centuries, understood as a single, coherent people. This understanding rested heavily on Julius Caesar. His account of the Gallic Wars, written in spare military Latin over the course of the campaign itself, is one of the most read texts from the ancient world. Caesar divided Gaul into 3 parts: Belgica in the northeast, Celtica in the center, Aquitania in the southwest, and described each section's inhabitants with the confident precision of a man who needed his readers to believe he knew exactly what he was conquering. The Belgae, he noted, were the most warlike of all the Gauls, almost Germanic in character, sharpened by constant conflict across the Rhine. Historians read Caesar for 2,000 years. Archaeologists added the artifacts, the Laten torques, the chariot burials, the sacred enclosures called Nimiton. The image solidified. The Gauls became a recognized type, a Celtic founding people with a coherent origin in Central Europe, who swept westward and built the civilization that Rome eventually absorbed. That was the story going into the first ancient DNA analysis of Iron Age Gaul. It was not the story that came out the other side. The first systematic genetic study of ancient Gaulish individuals was published in 2020, led by Brunel and colleagues. The researchers extracted and analyzed DNA from 16 individuals recovered from Iron Age burial sites across the territory Caesar described. 13 samples came from northern Gaul, from Picardy and Alsace, associated with the Belgic tribal confederacies that Caesar had flagged as almost Germanic. The remaining 3 came from southern Gaul, from Occitania, associated with the Valcae tribe, people of the warm Mediterranean fringe. The working assumption, built on decades of archaeological consensus, was that the data would look roughly uniform, a recognizable Celtic genetic pattern tracking the westward expansion of Latin culture from its Central European homeland. The data was not uniform. The Belgic samples from the north clustered differently from the Valcae samples in the south. The northern individuals showed genetic profiles that matched most closely with modern Belgians and Welsh populations on the Atlantic fringe of northwestern Europe. The southern individuals pulled towards southern French and Swiss populations. Within the northern dataset alone, there was significant individual variation. Heterogeneity that could not be explained by a single migration event or a single founding population. Caesar had been right about one thing. The Belgae were different, but not in the way he implied. The Belgic individuals in the genetic study did not simply show Germanic admixture layered on top of a Celtic base. They showed a profile with deep roots in the Western European genetic substrate. The ancient populations that had been living along the Atlantic coast for thousands of years before any Celtic culture arrived from the east. What the data suggested was not a Germanic-tinged Gaul. It was a population with its own distinct history, one that had adopted the Gaulish cultural framework while carrying genetics that predated and differed from the Central European Latin homeland. Then came the 2024 study by Lafranchi and colleagues, which extended the picture east of the Alps. 12 individuals from the Cenomani Gauls, a branch that had migrated south into northern Italy, settling in the region of modern Verona during the 4th century BCE, were analyzed from burials dated between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. These were Gauls who had crossed the mountains, established themselves on Roman territory, and eventually become some of the most reliable auxiliary soldiers in the Roman military. Rome needed their fighting skills. Rome also needed to absorb them. By the 1st century BCE, the Cenomani were Roman allies, not Roman enemies. Their DNA showed something the migration story hadn't predicted. The Y chromosome lineages from the northern Italian Gauls connected not only to Central European Iron Age populations, but also showed affinities with older genetic substrates present in Italy before any Gaulish migration arrived. These were not simply transplanted French. They were a population shaped by both their migration history and their contact with the populations they moved among. A genetic record of centuries of interaction with the people of the Po Valley, the Ligures, the Veneti, the early Romans. The Gauls in Italy were not the Gauls in France, and neither of them were simply the Gauls in Caesar. When researchers compared the full dataset of ancient Gaulish samples against the genetic profiles of modern European populations, the results produced a finding that cuts directly against 2,000 years of French national mythology. France considers itself the inheritor of the Gauls. The Republic traces its civic identity through them. The phrase "our ancestors, the Gauls," was once taught in French colonial classrooms in West Africa and Southeast Asia. An absurdity that later generations recognized and dismantled, but one that reveals how deeply the Gaul equals France equation was embedded in the national imagination. The genetics do not support that equation. The modern populations most closely related to the ancient Gaulish samples are not the French. The strongest matches run to the Belgians, the Welsh, the Bretons of northwestern France. The modern French, particularly in the north and east, show substantial genetic input from the Franks, a Germanic people who moved into former Roman Gaul in the 5th century CE. From Norse settlers in Normandy, and from Roman-era population movements that brought Eastern Mediterranean signals deep into the former Celtic heartland. The Gaulish DNA did not vanish, but it was diluted, and it was diluted unevenly. The Atlantic West, Brittany especially, along with pockets of southwestern France, retained more of the ancient signal. The rest was gradually overwritten by the arrivals that followed. This means the people most loudly claiming Gaulish ancestry are, genetically speaking, not the closest to it. And the populations carrying the most direct biological continuity with Iron Age Gaul are the ones living on the Atlantic fringes. The Welsh, the Bretons, the Belgians, communities that have never made the Gauls the center of their founding mythology. Identity, the data keeps insisting, is not the same thing as genetics. There is one finding within the ancient Gaulish dataset that deserves particular attention because of what it says about how Celtic culture actually spread. Among the male lineages recovered from Iron Age burials in Western Gaul, the dominant Y chromosome haplogroup is R1b, specifically the Western Atlantic sub-branch of R1b that is today one of the most common paternal lineages in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and Brittany. This is not a new arrival from Central Europe. It is an old signal. It represents populations that were already living along the Atlantic coast of Europe thousands of years before Latin culture emerged and spread westward. What this tells us is that in Western Gaul, at least, the Celtic transformation was not primarily demographic. People did not arrive from Central Europe and replace the existing population. What arrived was a culture, a language, a set of religious practices, a tradition of metalwork and coinage and burial. That was adopted by communities who had been living on the Atlantic fringe for millennia and who carried genetics that connected them to the ancient populations of prehistoric Europe. The Gauls in the West were, in large part, local people who became Celtic, not immigrants who arrived Celtic. This is the distinction that rewrites the history most fundamentally. It is also the distinction that the ancient sources could not and did not record, because no Roman general or Greek geographer had any interest in the question of whether the people they called Gauls had always spoken Gaulish or had learned to speak it at some point in the preceding centuries. The cultural label was what mattered. The genetic history underneath it was invisible to them. Ancient DNA made it visible. Pull all of this together and a picture emerges that is considerably more complex than the one Caesar gave us and considerably more interesting. The Gauls were not a single people moving outward from a single origin. They were the result of multiple processes operating across different timescales in different parts of Europe. In the east, along the Rhine and the Danube, the genetic signal looks more like a genuine westward migration of Latin culture bearers from a Central European homeland. In the west, along the Atlantic coast, it looks like cultural adoption by long-established local populations. In the south, in Occitania and northern Italy, it looks like migration overlapping with mixture from Mediterranean populations already present. Caesar saw one thing and called it by one name. The DNA sees three things at minimum, and the name Gaul turns out to be a political and linguistic label, covering a genetic reality far more layered than any Roman general was equipped to notice. But here is the part that no one expected. The data doesn't just complicate the story of the Gauls. It quietly dismantles one of the most durable founding myths in all of Western history. A myth so embedded in one nation's identity that challenging it still feels, in some quarters, like an act of cultural aggression. This matters beyond ancient history. France did not simply misremember the Gauls. It built a national identity around a simplified version of them that served specific political purposes at specific historical moments. The Gaulish warrior became the emblem of French republican virtue. Independent, courageous, resistant to empire. The fact that this emblem was partly projected onto a much more complicated genetic and cultural reality does not make the French identity built around it any less real. But it makes it more honest to acknowledge the gap between the story and the evidence. The Gauls did not need to be a single coherent people to matter. What they built, the oppida, the trade networks, the metalwork, the language, the resistance at Alesia, was real regardless of how genetically heterogeneous the people who built it turned out to be. The genetic heirs of the ancient Gauls are scattered across the Atlantic fringe of Europe. In Wales and Brittany and parts of Belgium, many of them have never thought of themselves as Gaulish. The DNA connects them to something older than any of those narratives. Iron Age farmers and warriors who spoke a language no one alive today has ever heard spoken, who built cities that Rome eventually absorbed, who resisted an empire with everything they had. The bones have been in the ground for 2,000 years. The DNA inside them was never going anywhere. It waited while Caesar wrote his account and historians repeated it, and nations built their founding myths on top of it. Then science learned to read what the bones were saying. And what the bones say is this: the story was always larger than the story we told. The Gauls were never simply what we thought they were. They were a convergence of migrations and mixtures and cultural adoptions, stretching back further than the written record can follow. History was never written in a single hand. It was written in bone. And the Gauls, it turns out, wrote it in several languages at once.